Thank you for taking the HistoryBuff.com virtual tour of the McLean House in Appomattox, Virginia. This was the site where the surrender papers were signed by General Lee and General Grant to end the Civil War. It is said that the American Civil War started in Wilmer McLean's front yard in 1861 and ended in his back parlor in 1865. The first battle of Bull Run, fought on July 21, 1861, took place on the McLean farm. When Wilmer McLean defaulted on repayment loans, it was sold at public auction in 1869. In 1891, the property was sold to speculators who intended to capitalize on the notoriety of the property. The house was dismantled and packed for shipping to Chicago for the Columbian Exposition in 1893. Due to cash flow and legal problems, the plan was never brought to fruition. The home sat dismantled in piles, prey to vandals, collectors, and the environment for over 50 years. In 1940, the Appomattox Court House National Monument was created by Congress, intending to restore the site. The whole project was brought to a swift stop on December 7, 1941, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. After World War II, the site was restored and opened to the public in 1949. We are now in the McLean House parlor. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia to Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant at the home of Wilmer and Virginia McLean in the rural town of Appomattox Court House, Virginia. General Lee arrived at the McLean home shortly after 1 p.m., followed a half hour later by General Grant. The meeting lasted approximately an hour and a half. The terms agreed to by General Lee and Grant and accepted by the federal government would become the model used for all other surrenders which shortly followed. The surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia allowed the federal government to redistribute forces, increase pressures to bear in other parts of the South that would result in the surrender of the remaining field armies of the Confederacy over the next few months. We are now in the McLean master bedroom. The McLeans, an upper-middle-class family, had moved to Appomattox Court House as refugees during the war. Wilmer and Virginia McLean had 5 children, 4 daughters and a son, at the time the surrender papers were signed. One other child had died in 1857. They had another child in September 1865. Wilmer McLean was a merchant and in the wholesale and retail groceries business. Wilmer also worked for the Internal Revenue Service from 1873 to 1876. In 1876, he was transferred to the U.S. Customs Bureau and remained employed there until 1880. He died in 1882, and Mrs. McLean died in 1893. We are now in the McLean girls' bedroom. 4 girls shared this bedroom. Their names and ages at the time the surrender papers were signed were Maria, 20, Ossie, 19, Lula, 7, and Nanny, 2. Sometime before Lee and Grant met at the McLean home, 7-year-old Lula McLean had left her favorite doll in the parlor. The little rag doll was apparently left on the horsehair sofa that her sister Nanny McLean Spillman would later donate to the National Park Service. While the generals met, and the room was packed tightly with the entourage that was Grant's staff, the rag doll remained in the room where Lula had left it. When the meeting ended, Union officers, anxious to obtain souvenirs of the event, plundered the McLean's parlor, appropriating items including Lula's rag doll. She never saw that doll again. The body of the doll was made of coarse, unbleached cotton and stuffed. Inked on the simple round face were eyes and nothing more. Printed cotton fabric was stitched together to fashion a bodice, skirt, and leggings. The doll was donated to Appomattox Court House National Historic Park in December 1992 and is now on permanent display at the park. We are now in the McLean's son's bedroom. The McLeans had only one son. His name was Wilmer Jr., and he was 11 when the surrender papers were signed. This site is one of the few historical sites in America that did not have to deal with urban sprawl encroaching on the area. Soon after the surrender papers were signed, the railroad built a line to the west of this site. The town virtually became a ghost town. Many history books relate that the surrender papers were signed in the Appomattox Court House. In reality, Appomattox Court House was the name of the town and not the building. The surrender papers were signed in the McLean home in Appomattox Court House, Virginia. The formal copy of Grant's surrender terms was written out by Eli Parker, a Native American. Lee remarked to Parker, "I am glad to see one real American here." Parker later stated, "I shook his hand and said, 'We are all Americans.'" Parker's library is in the Appomattox Court House National Historical Park collection. We are now in the McLean's dining room. The portrait on the back wall on the left is of Wilmer McLean Sr. The portrait on the right is of Mrs. Virginia McLean. The surrender terms paroled the officers and enlisted men, but required that all Confederate military equipment be relinquished. When General Lee asked if the terms allowed his men to keep their horses, for in the Confederate Army, men owned their own mounts, Lee explained that his men would need these animals to farm once they returned to civilian life. Grant responded that he would order his officers to allow any Confederate claiming a horse or a mule to keep it. General Lee agreed that this concession would go a long way toward promoting healing. Grant's generosity extended further. When Lee mentioned that his men had been without rations for several days, the Union commander arranged for 25,000 rations to be sent to the hungry Confederates. After formal copies of the surrender terms and Lee's acceptance had been drafted and exchanged, the meeting ended. On the morning of April 10, 1865, Generals Lee and Grant had their last meeting at Appomattox Court House. General Lee requested that his men be given some type of evidence that they were paroled prisoners to protect them from arrest or annoyance. The parole passes were printed in this room of the Clover Tavern. General Gibbon was ordered to arrange for a small printing press to print the blank parole forms. General George Sharp supervised the operation. Printing began the afternoon of the 10th and continued from daylight to a late hour each night through the 15th. The total number of officers and men paroled was 28,231. Rolls in duplicate have been prepared of the different commands. On the backs of these was placed a printed slot to be duly filled out and signed by General George H. Sharp, the Assistant Provost Marshal. In addition, each officer and man, when he separated from his command, was given one of the parole passes, to which was signed by his immediate commanding officer. This concludes the virtual tour of the McLean House and Press Room in the Clover Tavern in Appomattox Court House, Virginia.